but this time it's different. The podcast where we take long, weird looks at global systems that are barely held together by duct tape, warlords, and polite diplomatic fictions. I'm Sinead, an aerospace and defense economist, investor, and now with this podcast, quite literally a geopolitical gossip columnist.
And I'm Alex, a finance and technology writer and someone who got literally tied up with all the red string they were trying to use to map Yemen's political factions on a corkboard.
So today's podcast is going to follow Alex's obsession, and we're going somewhere the world mostly stopped going to a few years ago, Yemen, which it turns out is not just a country in crisis, but maybe a crisis that never fully became a country.
Yeah, so to start, Yemen has basically never really been a single functioning state for the majority of its history. Sort of Yemen, as sort of currently consisted, is a little bit of a kind of fiction that arose in the past few decades. It's a land of mountains, deserts, tribal confederations that didn't get the memo about centralized governance, or, well, they read it. They looked at their large arsenal of weapons and decided they didn't agree with it. And so various foreign empires have tried. The Ottomans failed. The British essentially ran part of the country before giving up. And even post-colonial regimes mostly ruled from their compounds while pretending that the hinterlands weren't actively rejecting them.
In 1990, the North and the South merged. Well, on paper, what really happened was that the North absorbed the South in this kind of shotgun wedding officiated by, well, the usual suspects of oil markets and World Bank advisors, and the general political hangover of the Cold War. North Yemen was tribal and deeply militarized, as Alex, you've already said, and South Yemen had been a Marxist state, the only communist country in the Arab world, which, I don't know, it's kind of like being the only vegan at a Texas barbecue. The merger was supposed to bring unity. Instead, it brought power consolidation and mass resentment, and of course, a brief but bloody civil war in 1994, when the South tried to succeed again and was bombed back into compliance.
Presiding over this chaos was one man, Abdullah Saleh, a former army officer, former president of North Yemen, which he ruled from 1978 onwards. And then he became the first leader of the unified state from 1990 until 2012. And he built probably the closest thing Yemen has seen to a state, but not exactly along kind of conventional Western lines.
So Saleh didn't govern in any Western sense of the word as we would know about it. I mean, he didn't build institutions. He more built these kind of informal networks, this lattice of tribal sheikhs and military commanders, business cronies, and corrupt officials, all kind of bound together by cash, coercion, and calculated neglect. Actually, one US ambassador described his rule as survival through patronage. And of course, ministers came and went, but loyalty to Saleh, that got you cash payments, a military commandment, or in some cases, control of an entire province, which sounds weirdly similar to what we're seeing today in the United States.
Although perhaps in a bit of a twist, the other thing that was sort of popular thing to give to tribal chiefs to win their loyalty was cars. So you'd give them like guns, a load of money, and cars. The most popular one at the moment, and has been for the past few years, if you need to win over someone in Yemen with a lot of guns, they cannot get enough Toyota Land Cruisers. I think it's because the terrain is very mountainous, and I think it's comparatively easy to get spare Toyota parts in the Middle East. But, you know, if
anyone wants to get into warlording in the Middle East, it's only going to cost you a couple of Land Cruisers.
Yeah, they're going for about $70,000, $80,000 at the moment. Anyway, Allah described ruling Yemen, and I always like this phrase, as dancing on the heads of snakes, and he really meant it. Every region, tribe, and power center was its own viper, and he never really tried to tame them. He was a master of basically winning over some of them and then just playing the rest off against each other.
Yeah, he rotated through generals to prevent power bases, basically, and he gave just enough weapons to tribal allies to make them somewhat useful, and just enough threats to make them a little bit afraid. And he turned the presidency into this kind of bazaar of favors and grudges where everything was negotiable accept dissent. And, somehow this kind of worked. For 30 years, Yemen stayed together. I mean, not because it was strong, of course, but because Salah was the only person who knew how to keep the snakes from eating each other. Until, of course, they did eventually turn on him too.
During the 1990s, in the far north of Yemen, in this province called Sada, which is like very, very mountainous, this small religious revivalist group emerged. They called themselves the Believing Youth, which started off as a sort of ideological summer camp. These Zaidi Shia teenagers learning scripture and theology and seething over how Saudi-funded Salafist missionaries were flooding their region.
Zaydism is a minority branch of Shia Islam and is literally allergic to Saudi interference. Historically, Zaydi imams ruled parts of northern Yemen for like 1,000 years. And then the 20th century happened. Of course, revolution, secularism, Wahhabism, and a state that increasingly treated these highlands that you're talking about, Alex, like a forgotten back room with terrible lighting. And the Believing Youth movement was part religious revival, part cultural defense mechanism.
If the idea of youth summer camps in the mountains centered around religious revival and cultural defense makes you a little bit nervous, makes you nervous with good reason, because somewhat unsurprisingly, the Believing Youth guys did radicalize quite quickly, especially following 9/11 and US action in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they began to adopt their now notorious slogan, God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. Please do not quote me saying that out of context, or clip that up.
It's going to be the teaser for the podcast.
This is what will get me cancelled. I don't support any of those things. Anyhow, the group began to be known as the Houthis. The group was named after its founding cleric, Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi. And the group in the early 2000s began staging more and more anti-Salah protests after Salah had decided to align himself publicly very strongly with the US during the War on Terror. And the Yemeni government issued an arrest warrant for al-Houthi in June 2004, which triggered the first of 6 separate wars that broke out between the government and his increasingly armed and pissed off group. The man himself was killed in the first wave of fighting, but the name has stuck to the present day.
Yemen, off the back of this, now has one of the most heavily armed civilian populations in the world, which honestly is kind of impressive considering that Texas exists. Tribal regions in the north, including Sada, the Houthi stronghold, had easy access to weapons through these kind of informal markets. But unlike the Texans, these guys are not fucking around. They weren't just going for shotguns and AR-15s. I mean, sure, they use personal tribal and black market channels to purchase small arms, but they also kind of got their RPGs and even heavier weapons like mortars along with it. The fighting was brutal, and you got to use the weapons for something. The government's military campaigns flattened villages, displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians, and crucially radicalized an entire generation of Zaidi youth. In 2010, an uneasy truce was reached, and Salah proclaimed victory for now.
Fast forward a year, the Arab Spring begins to hit Yemen hard, and Salah, while he could play the snakes off against each other, not wildly popular. I mean, a third of the country's Zaidi, they're not very happy after the war that's just happened, and the rest are pretty pissed off about rampant corruption. It's been estimated that Salah alone was one of the richest men in the world and had tens of billions of dollars stuffed it away in overseas bank accounts. So the protests kick off, and within about a year, he's forced out. So his vice president, Abradur Mansour Hadi, takes over, and it's fair to say he's a bit of a damp squib right from the beginning. He's a technocrat who's allegedly pretty corrupt himself and has no charisma and even less control.
Oh, I love alleged corruption. So Hadi had none of the things that made Salah successful. So no tribal networks, no power base, and definitely no leverage. Meanwhile, Salah, he hasn't gone anywhere. He's still holding court in the capital like nothing happened, as if he weren't displaced. And, with tribal leaders lining up outside his house for favors, just like the good old days. And, again, it's kind of like Mar-a-Lago after Biden's inauguration. So by 2014, when the Houthis decided to make a move, there was no one to stop them.
Yeah, so the uprising got going. They rolled south from Sada. They seized the capital, Sana'a, with shocking speed. Hadi flees first to the southern port of Aden and then to Riyadh, where the Saudis put him up in, the Novotel or somewhere like that. And in a plot twist that would make Machiavelli wince, Salah, the same man who'd spent years fighting the Houthis, suddenly allies with them. And this is where Saudi Arabia and the UAE step in. So, along with a coalition of Middle Eastern allies and with UN backing, they launch a coalition war to restore the sort of internationally recognized government of Yemen, which largely consisted of flying airstrikes in a support of a president who was hiding in a basement somewhere. And to be fair, the Saudi coalition succeeded in staunching the bleeding. Like they essentially managed to freeze the Houthi advance and take back some territory.
Well, karma is a bitch because it eventually came for Salah. However, in 2017, when Salah tried to double cross the Houthis again and realign with the Saudis, I mean, this guy clearly does not know what's good for him. The Houthis responded by ambushing him outside his house and killing him, which is less retirement plan and more coup insurance.
Yeah, my understanding with this one sounds wild at the time was there was this brief window in 2017 where it looked like the kind of Yemeni government forces were about to make this big push for Hodeidah, which is this sort of strategically vital port that the Houthis controlled then and still control now. I think Salah had thought maybe the game was about to be up and thought this was the moment to change sides, but yes, clearly miscalculated badly on that front. And the messiness gets worse here because we talk about the coalition, but that coalition is probably being a little bit charitable. And because the kind of the various actors at play, despite siding with the actual government, having oil wealth and a formal mandate from the international community, in the beginning of the conflict basically spends quite a lot of its time fighting with itself.
I mean, this does not only get messy, this is complex beyond comprehension. So let's break this down. Saudi Arabia decides to back Islah initially, and Islah is Yemen's main Sunni Islamist party and is the local franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood, has grassroots networks, religious legitimacy, and just enough political infrastructure to seem, I don't know, somewhat useful. There's just one problem. The UAE despises the Muslim Brotherhood.
We should probably touch on exactly who the Muslim Brotherhood are.
So the Muslim Brotherhood, good point, Alex, is the Sunni Islamist organization that was founded in Egypt in 1928, and it promotes the idea that Islam should guide political and social systems. While it has operated through political parties and social services in some countries, critics accuse it of seeking to undermine secular states and kind of having these ties to extremism, meaning it is banned in a number of Arab countries. The UAE particularly sees it as a threat to its relatively secular system.
The UAE, with this in mind, doesn't support Islam and instead begins supporting other armed groups. Yes, armed groups, plural. One of them is the Southern Transitional Council, which is this separatist faction that wants to split Yemen back in two and restore South Yemen as an independent state. It only believes the Houthis are marginally worse than the Muslim Brotherhood, and it has emerged as one of the kind of most powerful anti-Houthi forces in the country.
Right, and then there's the Giants Brigade, which, I don't know, kind of sounds like an American ice hockey team, but that aside, it is actually a UAE-backed anti-Houthi group with troops drawn from tribal militias, which are trained, equipped, and kind of marketed like private equity-backed war brand. They're actually one of the few groups in the war with any kind of battlefield discipline. And honestly, if you Google them, a pretty great logo, which, Alex, is half the fight.
And then there's Tariq Salah, the nephew of the late Ali Abdullah Salah, the original snake dancer. After his uncle was killed by the Houthis, Tariq formed the National Resistance Forces, which is like a kind of family business with more artillery. So it brought together army units that had been loyal to his late uncle and then attracted extra backing from the UAE. And interestingly, another member of the Salah family is running a political party that is still loyal to the Houthis. So, family gatherings must be great fun in that dynasty.
Yeah, no, you thought Thanksgiving was bad. So, on the off chance that our two listeners are still following, I think I need to recap because my mind is like losing it here. Okay, So Saudi Arabia is backing this theocratic party it used to distrust. And the UAE is backing a secessionist movement, an elite fighting unit, and a revenge tour led by a dictator's nephew. And all of these groups are technically on the same side, that is the anti-Houthi side, bear with me here, except half of the time, I can't even say this with a straight face, they're shelling each other or stealing territory or, I don't know, blocking each other's supply lines out of spite.
I mean, there were actual shootouts in Aden, which is the temporary capital of the internationally recognized government, between militias backed by different foreign governments, which makes even quite unpleasant NATO summits sound like a kind of world of peace and harmony.
Yeah, and at this time, this internationally recognized president, who again is Hadi, is still technically in charge at this stage. Technically. But at this point, he's mostly just a WhatsApp group, and that group is muted. No one gives a shit about this guy.
Yeah, and the kind of interesting story, as we've outlined this, is obviously the coalition is somewhat chaotic, but how do the Houthis, who are an insurgent movement from the mountains, hold off against this kind of coalition, which is very well resourced, has advanced military equipment supplied by the West? And I think it boils down to a few factors that we're going to discuss: a mixture of terrain, experience, weapons, and governance.
So, Alex, you've already talked about the terrain. Yemen's north is a fortress disguised as a landscape. Mountains, valleys, switchbacks. Every pass is a choke point, and every village is this kind of natural stronghold. And it's like trying to fight guerrillas inside a rock tumbler. And Saudi air power, which, great in theory, in practice, however, the collateral damage began to make Western allies uneasy.
And the second thing that the Houthis have going for them is experience. They've spent, the 2000s dodging Salah's artillery. They've got field commanders who started as teenagers fighting in the mountains. They now run battalions. And the coalition just doesn't have this advantage. You have a mixture of Sudanese mercenaries, Emirati sort of trained special forces, local militias who are frankly not very trustworthy, and if you don't keep topping up the Land Cruiser slush fund, are liable to defect mid-battle, or needed Google Translate to understand who they were fighting. So trying to lead this group of people through unfamiliar territory to fight a motivated and experienced opponent was a rough gig.
Well, these people have the third thing, which is weapons. They inherited heavy arms from Salah's kind of fractured military, and then they upgraded with the help of Iran. They modified Scud missiles, drone programs, anti-ship capabilities, as we've talked about on this podcast many times. They took what was smuggled in and re-engineered the rest, kind of clever, in mountain workshops, and they started hitting back hard. Saudi oil infrastructure, airports, command posts, all the kind of stuff you hear about on the news. These were not symbolic attacks either. They were strategic warnings launched from basically a cave in the mountains with a Wi-Fi hotspot.
I think the last point, which is a bit uncomfortable, is that the Houthis weren't just this sort of chaotic group of tribesmen. They actually governed. They set up functioning parallel institutions, courts, police, tax collection, intelligence agencies. They run education programs and television states. They print their own currency. It's not a liberal democracy. I mean, these parallel institutions are enforced brutally, and dissent is not well received. But they did represent something close to order in, a country where the official government can't run its own cabinet meetings.
And they cracked down on corruption. I mean, selectively, of course, but they installed their own intelligence services in nearly every town that they controlled. And they were pretty ruthless, as you said, with the dissent, not in a kind of theoretical sense, but in a very real disappear you and your brother way. The message was obviously clear. We're in charge now, and we ain't going anywhere.
Yes, so the international community kept issuing statements and funding PowerPoints. Yes, well, as you say, the Houthis built a missile program, a propaganda network, and a sort of state, if a deeply paranoid, militarized, and quasi-theocratic one that increasingly became quite well armed, starting with, as you say, its own kind of armed civilian population and network, to one that was quite clearly being armed with rather more heavy and impressive and long distance weaponry from Iran.
The result is that by mid 22, the Yemen file literally slid off every foreign desk agenda. Hadi was removed by his allies, and a kind of fragmented new presidential leadership council, which is made up of different faction representatives, reached an uneasy truce with the Houthis, unable to make progress and exhausted by infighting. The UN appeal funding fell from 83% coverage in 2019 to 45% in 2022. So basically, people were bored of this issue. And field reporters shrank from dozens to only 3 permanent bureaus because who's reading the news about Yemen anymore?
Yes, and then 7th of October 2023 happens. Hamas hits Israel in, the day that sort of shocked the world, and Israel responds. And the Houthis begin firing within about 2.5 weeks their first anti-ship cruise missiles into the Red Sea. This was, on one level, a statement of solidarity with Hamas and the Palestinian cause, loosely defined. But it was something bigger. It was move for market share. It was the Houthis going, we aren't just a Yemeni faction or a local insurgency. We are a serious regional player who is part of Iran's axis of resistance, along with Hamas and Hezbollah, and we deserve funding and support.
And this is where we get back to our obsession with shipping. This tactic paid off pretty instantly for the Houthis. And Bab al Mandab, which is 30 kilometers wide, has 21,000 vessels moving through it per year and facilitates 12% of global seaborne trade, turned yellow on insurance maps. The average war risk premium jumped from $950 to a whopping $7,500 per transit in only 4 weeks. The big players, such as Maersk, Costco, MSC, all diverted their shipping by the Cape. The average sail time on the Asia-Europe route lengthened by 10 to 14 days, which added around, $1 million in bunker fuel per round trip.
And so the US, unsurprisingly, wasn't delighted with this turn event. So it launched Operation Prosperity Guardian, resulting in 100 strike sorties between January and March 2024, and then sort of later in the year and early this year, they followed this up with kind of further rounds of airstrikes. But the Pentagon's own briefings admit that they had about a 56% target destruction rate, as the Saudis had kind of discovered earlier in the conflict. Actually hitting targets in like deeply rugged mountainous terrain that you don't know very well is really difficult. Launchers would reappear faster than they were cratered. And the issue was, is some of these strikes were being carried out using cruise missiles. Others were being conducted by like quadcopters and cheap drones. And the US found themselves having to use these multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot down drones that cost hundreds of dollars. I think in just a fortnight at one stage in the conflict, the US burnt through $1 billion of munitions to relatively little effect.
Meanwhile, in Yemen, the 9-person Presidential Leadership Council in Aden controls roughly 18% of GDP producing territory, and amongst all of this has zero sovereign airspace. Its annual budget, which is around $2.2 billion and is 94% donor funded, mostly I'm sure through land cruisers, is similar to Ria's monthly spend on public sector wages alone. And it has no navy. It has 2, I think, operative fighter jets and a central bank reserve of only $200 million. And this is roughly, for comparison purposes, what Dubai spends every year on water fountains.
Have you seen some of those water fountains in Dubai? Like, they're pretty sick. Contrast that, yes, as you say, with like the Houthis, like de facto state. I mean, they make something like $30 million on just taxing fuel imports that go through Hodeidah, which is that port I mentioned earlier. They make about $500 million a year from just telecoms revenues from companies they control. They have a sort of security intelligence service of thousands. And yeah, an arsenal that includes Quds 2 cruise missiles, which have a range of 800 kilometers. I had 3 UAVs that can be in the air for 24 hours, mint coins, that curricula, and yeah, license exports when they aren't lobbing ballistic missiles at civilian areas or, Liberian flag car carriers.
And the bottom line here really is that legitimacy is optional. but leverage is compulsory. The Houthis did not become stronger than the coalition. The coalition's cohesion index fell from fragile to fractional. They simply stayed in the ring until every better funded opponent started checking their watch and, as we saw with the US recently, their bank balance. So, what is Yemen now? I mean, Alex, it's not a failed state because that implies that it tried and then collapsed. And it's not a civil war because that suggests that there are two clear sides. I mean, God, there's at least 11,000 here. And we know that it's not a unified country, if there's one thing that we know. I mean, the last thing it shared was a flag, and even that is disputed. It's kind of like this geopolitical phantom, right? Because a map is still printed and the borders are still obviously there, but reality has long since been overtaken by these factions and fuel prices and mostly now foreign disinterest.
And we have an extra complicating factor that's sort of joined the mix recently. So after a Houthi ballistic missile almost hit Ben Gurion International Airport, the Israeli Air Force has been hitting targets inside Yemen, including Houthi military installations in Hodeidah, and they've now hit Sana'a International Airport twice. And while the US is now on this sort of ceasefire with the Houthis have explicitly said that this doesn't apply to Israel. And this, yeah, has the potential to inject an extra element of chaos. And like, I think one thing we haven't really touched on in the podcast is that like political carnage is on one level darkly comic, but the Yemeni people have had like pretty rough time of it. Like, we're talking one of the worst kind of humanitarian crises in the world, famines, cholera outbreaks, and yeah, it doesn't look like improvements around the corner.
No, and it's kind of wild because it is precisely those lack of improvements, as I mentioned earlier, that have driven this lack of interest from the West that kind of forgot about the issue. This issue in particular that I refer to being the terrible condition that the Yemeni people are living in through this escalation.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure we will return to this topic both as the geopolitical situation develops. I'm sure you'll take any opportunity you can to talk about piracy and like mercenaries again. So
Exactly. So thanks for listening to But This Time It's Different, the show where forgotten conflicts become global risks and rival groups become state actors with airtime. We'll be back next week.
yeah, assuming that the UAE doesn't back me to secede by myself and start my own podcast.
You're not going to get rid of me, are you?
Depends if you support the Muslim Brotherhood or not.
Okay, on that note, goodbye.
Bye.